Now that we have moved most of the logic responsible for updating the position of our indicator in a separate composable function, in this lesson we're going to consider another approach, how we can achieve the same thing, but maybe the new approach will be more applicable to our case, because we're going to have to listen to time updates every second from other components, for example from the component that shows label of the hour. Because once our indicator reaches this hour becomes active, so therefore this hour label should be highlighted. So let's do the following. All the logic we have earlier extracted into a separate composable function. Now we're going to create the new file for the global module, which is going to store all the logic related to updating the time every second. So I'm basically going to move this composable file into the source folder and rename it on time. So now we're not gonna use composable function for this, but instead global module, and which is why we need to remove declaration of the composable function in this file, as well as return value of this function, since this is no longer a composable function, but a global module. But still our timeline indicator component needs to know percentage of amount of seconds passed since midnight up until this moment, which is why we're gonna have to export this computed property. So let's add an export keyword right in front of this declaration. And since we're now located inside of a global module, not in one of the components, we cannot use lifecycle hooks of the component such as onActivated and onDeactivated in this file. So I'm going to extract the logic of these hooks into a separate functions. Let's create the function which is going to start the timer to update the time every second. And instead what we'll do in the component is call onActivated hook, passing reference to the function which should start the timer like this. And the same thing let's do with the function inside of onDeactivated hook. But in this case, the function name will be stop timer, and all this function will do is basically call clear interval to stop the timer. And then we're gonna call onDeactivated, passing reference to this function. So now let's move both of these hooks calls inside of the timeline indicator component. Of course, both of these hooks should be imported from the Vue package. And now, since we are no longer using composable function to get seconds since midnight in percentage computed property, we're gonna import this computed property directly from our global module time. We can do this because earlier we have added export keyword in front of this declaration. So switching back to the timeline indicator component, and there is no need to call this composable function anymore. So let's remove this line. And also remove imports of hooks onActivated and onDeactivated from time module. But instead, as we can see inside the timeline indicator component, we're also referencing new functions from the time module, start timer and stop timer. So we also have to add imports for those. Let's do it right here. And looks like I forgot to export this function from the global time module. Let's go back to this module, scroll down to these function declarations and add export keyword. And just to see if these functions are going to be called in the appropriate times, I'm going to print something to the console in both of these functions, so we can make sure these functions get called. And there is one more thing to do before we can check it in the browser, and that is fix the path to the constants module, since this module is located on the same level as our current module. We need to use one dot in this path. And now we can switch over to the browser. And now after loading the timeline page, in the console we're supposed to see one log, which is start timer. This works, and once I'm gonna switch the page, the timer should be stopped, so another log should appear in the console. As we can see, it's working properly, and when going back to the timeline page, the timer should be started again, and the appropriate log should appear, so everything is working in this case. Now I'll just go back to the editor and remove those helper console log statements from these functions start timer and stop timer. And at this point, let's finish this lesson. The link to the repository with this project will be in the video description.